Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the launch of Your Time, Your Pay. My name is Rob Donnelly, and I'm the Policy and Research Assistant here at the Equality Trust. My colleague, Priya, who's our co-executive director, is also on the call with me tonight, and she will be hosting the Q&A section of the evening. Our comms officer, Dario Goodwin, is running the tech side of things. So he'll be managing the comments in the chat. And if people have any technical issues, please feel free to get in touch with Dario. Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to share and discuss the report with you all. Just a couple of housekeeping points to start with. If people could just stay muted when you're not speaking, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Sorry, Rob.
Sorry, go ahead, Priya.
I can hear two lots of the speaking, Dario.
Sorry, we're just trying to sort that out. Is that better?
Apparently it's just me, ignore that.
Okay. Just say this event is also being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Equality Trust YouTube channel afterwards. So if people would prefer, they can keep their cameras off. Also, please feel free to post questions throughout the evening on the chat. These will be picked up in the Q&A section at the end. Tonight we will be discussing the key findings and recommendations of the report, and we'll be hearing from some of our people, young people who worked and co-produced the project. Just to briefly introduce them. Finn Oldfield will be speaking. Olivia Brooker has kindly agreed to present some of the key findings of the report. We've also got Nkechi speaking as well. And we are very, very delighted to have Patrick McAllister, who is a Green Party councillor in Bristol, who will also be saying a few words, speaking to the kind of political recommendations of the report. Unfortunately, Mary Sayer from Uniting Schools is unable to attend tonight. She was just going to speak to how this report is going to help unions and how it's a useful tool. And she there's a quote from her on our press release, so you can have a look at that just to get a flavour of what she was going to say. I will now pass over to Olivia, who is just going to speak to some of the key findings of the report. So I'll hand over to Olivia.
Hey everyone. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. I have some presentation slides. So you should be able to see that now. Just a bit about me. So I got involved in this report through the focus group that happened to sort of co-produce the survey questions and then analyze the results. I've done some work with the Equality Trust before in the past during COVID. So I was really excited to be involved in this as well. And these groups really sort of opened my eyes to how little I knew about my rights as a worker, but also just how common this is among young people. I'm really excited about what's coming from this report. And just as a little background, there's not 27 slides, so it won't be as long as you might expect. So just to begin, a bit about the report. So the Equality Trust went to 1,018 16 to 24-year-olds to understand just how much we young people know. And the questions were based on pay, conditions, and trade union membership. So what did this report find? This report has estimated that 16.35 million hours of overtime worked by young people goes unpaid each year, and 183 million hours may not be paid. And if that wasn't hard-hitting enough, these hours equate to at least £147 million worth of lost pay, and potentially up to £1.6 billion worth of overtime not being paid correctly. So these figures have led from the fact that out of the respondents that the report received, over half worked overtime, with 56% of that group not always getting paid for their hours of overtime and 5% never getting paid, which equates to over 100,000 young people never being paid overtime each year. So just over 2/5 of the respondents have been asked to work for no pay, and 1/5 of them had completed an unpaid internship despite the government's efforts to outlaw them. And as you can see on the screen, the percentage of people asked to work for no pay is vastly different when it's depending on their gender, race, and geography. So we found that nearly 2/5 of respondents did not have a written employment contract. Surprisingly, this isn't a legal requirement for employers, but it's obviously very disempowering for young workers. Just to bring in my own experience, I've worked without a contract before, and I think it just leaves you feeling really out of control of your own pay, your holiday hours, your sick leave, and it gives you like no options to join a pension scheme. So yeah, it's not a great thing to not have. And 2/5 of respondents have been employed on a 0-hour contract, with 2/3 of these respondents stating that these contracts were exploitative. So as everyone knows, and has probably felt the effects of in some way, the cost of living crisis has been extremely damaging across the UK. As we can see on the screen, 48% of young people took action to mitigate the cost of living crisis. And that was from cutting down on their energy usage, not going out, borrowing money, or asking to work more hours, as you can see on the slide. But the increased uptake in working overtime is like particularly worrying, considering the previous statistics that I mentioned, where potentially £1.65 billion of overtime is not being paid correctly. So what do young people want from this? So 56% of us agree that wealth needs to be taxed in line with income, and 61% of young people agree that the FTSE 100 CEO pay should be more regulated. So currently the median FTSE 100 CEO pay of £3.41 million per year is 109 times the median earnings of a UK full-time worker. So that figure literally is crazy to me. So hence the belief that their pay should be more regulated. But unfortunately, young people are just not receiving the support they need in order to improve their rights at work. Out of the third of people that did receive info on their employment rights, only 51% had a lesson about employment rights, and a third simply received a leaflet on them. So the three main points that we can gather from this research is that the exploitation of young people at work is widespread, it's intersectional, and there is currently inadequate education and support on employment rights for young people. The actions that are being proposed beyond this report are to abolish the national minimum wage rates based on a person's age and uprate all under 23-year-olds to at least the national living wage rate, ban unpaid trial shifts, expand automatic pension enrolment to qualifying over 16-year-olds, and unions and other stakeholders should dedicate efforts and content to engaging with young people by amplifying their successes and busting negative myths about trade unions. So this report has just proven that young people are still ignored when it comes to our rights as workers, and changes is really necessary to end the inequalities I've just highlighted. So yeah, with that being said, I'm going to hand back to Rob, I think.
Thanks so much, Olivia. That's really fantastic, and thanks also for bringing in some of your own experiences as well. It was really interesting to hear that. I'm now going to hand over to Finn Oldfield, who will speak about his experience co-producing the report and also his experience of doing unpaid trial shifts. So I'll just hand over to you, Finn.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's really great to be here today. Just want to say a big hello to everyone on the call. So yeah, my name is Finn, and I'm delighted to be here for the report of the Your Time, Your Pay project. I want to thank, firstly, the brilliant staff and supporters of the Equality Trust that brought this work together and paid us young people for our time contributing to it. It was created in consultation with young people at its centre, with opportunities to research and frame the questions that were sent out and conducted nationally by Survation. And this report draws important inferences from the lived experience of young people in the workforce that have been time and time again exploited by an unfair system that puts profit over people. And as Olivia was just speaking to, the findings outline that over 2/5 of young people have worked for no pay. And I'm, similarly to what Olivia was bringing in with her lived experience, I'm one of those people. So in the past, I've undertaken unpaid trial shifts at a retail company alongside 30 other young people competing for just 2 jobs. I've worked for 2 weeks at a national digital news publisher for no pay at all. And when I was an intern at a progressive policy institute, won't name any names, but I worked 20 hours a week for 5 whole months with only a small stipend to take home, which now seems insane. Now, the more that I've learned about the employment space and been in it for quite a few years now, we're told that youth voice is important, but when young people's labour is met with unsafe working conditions and no remittance for our time, we kind of have to ask the question, is the labour market only in it for what it can do to take advantage of us? And instead of telling young people this is just how things are, we must demand a change and, empower future generations to level the playing field, because it's not going to happen without our contribution. So I would sort of pull attendees' attention to the fact that unpaid labour, looks different across various sectors, from the retail and service industries to the creative industries to charities and corporate fields. Too many companies want to use insights from young people without really compensating us for our time. So it's not just our time and bodies that are exploited, but it's our ideas too. And in some ways, it's a privilege to be able to complete unpaid internships and trial shifts. So when I was in university and working, my student loan just about managed to cover my living costs and housing while I worked for free. But others, particularly other working class young people like me and people from my community, they may not have this luxury. And when you can't rely on connections to get your foot on the economic ladder, you may have to rely on debasing yourself in an increasingly competitive job market that really does enable precarious living. But as we know, exposure doesn't pay the bills. So if we are to kind of encourage young people from across the class spectrum to contribute meaningfully to society, especially during the cost of living crisis, then paying them for the time is a necessity. As Olivia was just speaking to, when young people in the UK are losing up to 1.65 billion in overtime wage theft every year, and 100,000 young people never receiving overtime pay approximately, and unpaid trial shifts being seen as a legitimate tool to mine free labour, then it's clear that the game and the system is rigged against us. But fabulously with this project, with young people's insights and the Equality Trust's recommendations, the journey to a fairer economy can start now. And in the report, we're calling for legislation to be introduced to ban unpaid trial shifts, and we're urging trade unions and other stakeholders in this space to engage with young people before they enter the workforce and when they do, to educate them on our rights and responsibilities and entitlements. equality is better for everyone in the end, and precarious living stemming from unpaid trial shifts to unwritten employment contracts is a political choice that doesn't serve our interests. And it also doesn't benefit the vast swathes of society and local economies that would thrive if only young people were respected enough to be paid for their time. It's our time and it's our pay. Thank you.
Thanks, Finn. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's really interesting to hear about how those practices have become so normalized. And I think a lot of young people feel like they just have to work for free, or like that's just become a sort of fact of life for especially young graduates. So yeah, just that is almost an expectation that you should have to do that, and obviously that's completely wrong. So our next speaker is Patrick McAllister, who is a Green Party councillor in Bristol, and he's just going to speak to some of the recommendations of the report. So if I could just then hand over to you, Patrick.
Certainly, thank you very much, Rob. So hello everybody, my name is Patrick McAllister, and as you heard, I'm the Green Party councillor for Hotwells and Harbourside Ward in Bristol. I'd like to thank the Equality Trust for having me here to speak tonight. It's a real pleasure to be able to contribute to such an exciting event. Age discrimination in employment against young people is personal for me as well as political. When I was a student, I worked part-time at a swimming pool in between my lectures, and when I started, I was earning less than colleagues just a few years older than me. This was because I was in a lower minimum wage band compared to them, and the only pay rises I actually experienced at that job were because either the minimum wage went up or because I aged into a new band. Why was this okay? All of us were doing the same work, and yet we were paid differently. The argument that this is supposed to reflect greater experience falls flat when you consider that a 19-year-old who'd been working there for a year would be paid less than a 25-year-old who joined a week ago. It all was, I realised, just a way for employers to exploit young workers. This report, Your Time, Your Pay, is incredibly important, and it comes at a critical time. Discrimination against young people in the employment market is rife, and you cannot combat a problem if you don't know where to start. The Your Time, Your Pay report gives us that starting point, and it gives us the empirical evidence that we need to be able to call it out. As we heard earlier, young people lose tens of millions of pounds a year due to unpaid overtime, hundreds in fact, and 2/5 of us have worked for no pay in the past. That's not acceptable, and to be honest, before I read the report, I didn't realise the problem was actually that bad. The vast majority of young people don't have education on employment rights and are not in trade unions to counterbalance the power of employers. We work in fragmented service sector jobs with less economic security and barely any opportunity for advancements. And through it all, we see attacks by the national government on young people, our future prospects, and employment rights in general. But there is hope. The proposals in this report would revolutionise young people's rights and prospects in the employment market today. Banning trial shifts would mean many more jobs would be available to everyone, and not just people who could afford to work for free. Introducing things like pension auto-enrolment for young people would set us up for later life, and ending the injustice of age-based wages would mean that everyone, including young people, would be fairly compensated for the work that they do. I'm really proud to have been asked to come and introduce and talk about these policies tonight. It's amazing, and I'm proud to be a member of the Green Party, which has an incredible swathe of policies which support the equality and empowerment of young people in the employment market. We explicitly believe that everyone should be paid the same for work of equal value regardless of age. We believe that the hiring of interns should be transparent, and no one should be forced to take an unpaid internship or be required to pay in order to work. And we believe that every worker has the right to not be discriminated against and to be treated with equality in all circumstances. These are the principles and the policies that I'm proud to champion as a Green and as an elected politician. Equality and equal treatment are non-negotiable, and I'm thrilled that the Equality Trust has produced this report to stand up for the rights of young people today in today's very difficult job market. Thank you all again so much for having me today, and I'd like to just pass on the wholehearted support of the whole Green Party in the fight for equality for young people today. Well done and good luck for the future.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's really, really powerful words, and no, thank you so much for agreeing to speak tonight. It's really good to have your input and your perspective on our report. Thank you. So I'll now just pass over to our final speaker. So Nkechi, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, after all that interesting insight, I think it'll be a bit hard to follow, but thank you to other speakers as well. So I can talk through a bit about my experience of why I wanted to get involved with this project, why I thought it was important for young people to be involved, and my experience of learning about employment rights and learning through this project as well. So I was initially inspired to get involved because I'd volunteered with the Equality Trust in the past, and through the young activist stuff, and I found it quite interesting and an interesting organisation to engage with. So when I was made aware of this project, I thought it'd be an interesting way to like get back involved. It was a topic that I engaged with in a limited capacity in the past. Through like some of my interests in like economics, which I studied in undergrad, and thinking about whether young people should have like basic economics education throughout the curriculum and the kind of debates around that. But I also thought it was an interesting piece of work to get involved with. As some people have said, as a young person, I think for sometimes exploitation that comes as a result of our assumed ignorance towards our rights. So I think it was interesting to be a part of something that kind of looked into this. And yeah, to let people share their thoughts on this. So although I am a young person, I have a lot of experience working with other young people who mostly are younger than me. And although this covers a range of issues, I think it's very important to kind of build off of the voices and perspectives of young people rather than speaking for them. And I've been quite lucky to work with organisations like Equality Trust who try and do that. I also don't just think it's just a moral incentive to centre young people's voices in this. I think working with young people through wider projects, you kind of see the value of hearing young people's insight on such topics. And I thought a really important takeaway from the research, as much as the research finding itself, was the centering of young people's voices and the engagement through the project, as well as participants of research. The experience of working on the project, I felt like, as others have said, there was things that made the engagement, that facilitated the engagement, such as being compensated for the time you put into the project. But I also thought of other ways that engagement was facilitated, such as there was different ways to get involved. I started off initially with more group calls, but when my workload outside of a project shifted, there was ways to make sure that I could still input and get involved. And that was nice to really have my involvement championed. And I'd imagine others felt the same in terms of making participation accessible. I didn't feel that once I was busier, I was just kind of forced to not be involved anymore. And it was nice to kind of see the different, to have support tailored throughout the duration of a project, sorry. And then finally, just a little bit on my experience of learning about employment rights. So it was quite limited at school that most people would relate to, although I did study business and economics in my undergrad, and that led to some explorations of interest in employment rights and things like organizational culture and motivation in the workplace. That sometimes touched on compensation, it didn't really take a rights perspective. So although I've spent a lot of time learning about things around these issues, it was interesting to look back and actually think, no one's actually educated me on things like employment rights and where to find information on it and support on it. But I did notice and reflected on how that changed as I got older and moved away from school. And I think some people spoke about how the cost of living has impacted, speaking more about employment rights and how there's additional pressures to not just be able to take up unpaid shifts, and really feeling the impact of some exploitative practices. But I think also COVID and conversations around furlough, and a lot of my friends and myself having experiences like going through the recruitment process following university. I finished in 2020, as well as friends who were looking for work who weren't in education at the time either, was the fact that we were having conversations about companies never getting back to us, or interviews and not hearing back, or I was working part-time or in retail or all sorts of roles, and how we all had these shared experiences of no matter what type of work we were doing, we kind of realized that organizations weren't going to do what we thought was the right thing, which was either communicate that COVID was impacting recruitment or communicate that COVID was going to impact shifts and stuff. And I think some friends realizing that they didn't have as much rights as they want to, and things like furlough and other supports were rolled out. So I think that definitely sparked a lot of conversations around us, and conversations from a lot of different perspectives. And I think those with COVID having sparked those conversations around young people, I feel like it's definitely sustained, and that wider feeling of insecurity around work, which has now been alongside the additional pressure of the cost of living crisis, and as well as wider conversations around precarious work in all different sectors, kind of means that that conversation that started has been sustained. So yeah, to round off, it was very interesting to kind of look how these things were explored through the research, as well as how young people's views were captured.
Thanks, Nkechi. It was really good to get some perspective on your experience of education of employment rights, because that's really something that came out a lot in our focus groups as well. It's just the lack of good quality education around employment rights, which the report highlights. I'm now just going to pass over to Priya, who will be running the Q&A section of tonight's event. So over to you, Priya.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you very much to all the speakers. It's really great to hear all your stories and hear, the personal ways that the issues raised in the report actually impact you as individual people, and how that kind of permeates and kind of stays with you as well. So thank you very much for sharing all that with us. I'm going to start my first question with Patrick, because I understand he might not be able to stay till the end, so I'm going to grab him while he's still here. But also, anybody who's got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can get around to them as they come through. So Patrick, you kind of touched on a little bit in what you said then, but I thought it'd be quite nice to get a clear kind of understanding from you about how useful reports like this are in kind of shaping policy and giving policymakers an understanding of various issues.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hugely important. So from my perspective as a local councillor, if we want to bring a motion about employment justice for young people, for instance, which would help direct the resources of Bristol City Council, or and analogous to other local authorities that are out there, we can use the launch of a report like this as a springboard on what that motion is going to be about and how we present it, and we can take the empirical evidence that's in there and talk about it in our speeches to make it more compelling and more likely to be voted through. You can't tackle a problem like age-based discrimination in the employment market if you don't know what the problem is in the first place, if you don't have all the facts and figures. And politicians live busy lives, and it's just incredible to be able to access reports like this one. I had a read through it. It's some really brilliant work that has been gone into this, and to be able to take that and use it to inform party policy, which will inform, from my perspective, all the Green Party work that is carried out in the country on employment rights, but also specifically at the local level in local authorities, shaping the way that those authorities work with young people and work with employers to reduce that discrimination.
And so then you mentioned the kind of facts and figures and the empirical data. Does the, less quantitative, the more qualitative kind of case studies and people's experiences and does that help as well shaping policy? Or, is it a question of needing both, or is it one is better than the other, or having them in tandem?
I think you do need both. So while a policy a policy document will at a local authority might talk about the facts and figures, but in order to get that through, you need to convince people and who might not necessarily agree with you or might not have read all this documentation to begin with. And for that, you need to have the personal stories of people who have experienced the pay discrimination or unpaid internships or being expected to do a trial shift that won't lead anywhere just to fill the coffers of a big business which could afford a living wage. So you need both. You need to be able to have the numbers and the facts to put into the actual policy, and you need to have the stories and the personal experiences to bring people along with you and convince them that the policy is necessary.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And so this is a kind of question for everybody. I will pass it over to Nkechi first because you're on my screen where I see first, but it's a question for everybody involved. In your opinion, what do you think would make the biggest impact for young people in employment, in supporting them and increasing their rights and in lowering discrimination?
Okay, that's quite an interesting question and quite a big one. I guess there's no single answer, but in terms of supporting young people to know their rights, I think education is the obvious one, because a lot of people, and there's a lot of normalization as well. So I remember before we started having widespread conversations in my friend group, I would speak about like unpaid trial shifts and my friends would be like, you have to do it everywhere. And I think this kind of normalization is something that needs to be addressed, especially if you don't have these positive conversations and actually speak about what's happening. I think when it's framed as an issue that's inevitable, as opposed to an issue that's exploitative, young people aren't necessarily getting that education to dispel that, and then exploitative employers get to come in and kind of set the tone. Other things I think would be interesting is also like conversations and more solidarity, which is not necessarily like a policy solution or an easy solution. But I think like I've been on the side of also doing unpaid internships and benefiting from them because I was able to stay at home. But then I think there's people who've also had to do, I've also had to do unpaid work alongside working to subsidize that, which a lot of people also have to do. So I think realizing that it's not an issue that is something you just have to get on with, and some people benefit from, some people won't, because I think sometimes something which always came to mind for me, and when I still try and have conversations with less sympathetic friends about workplace rights now, is it's still that inevitable conversation. And sometimes my friends would say, oh, if you don't do it, someone else would. But something which stuck with me is, okay, what about the people who can't afford to? And what about the people who can't be subsidized by family to do unpaid internships? So the people who one more unpaid shift is really going to push them over the edge in terms of a poor financial situation or really dangerous and detrimental one. So I think, yeah, solidarity as well as education to sort of dispel what's become normalized, but should really be unacceptable.
Thank you, that's great. Olivia, have you got anything you'd like to add? What do you think would be the kind of biggest or a big impact for young people in the employment sector?
Yeah, I definitely agree that education is the place to start. What came to mind was when I was at school, we had, I don't know if it's like countrywide, but we'd have like work experience weeks where you'd like go out to wherever some people were like given places that they could work in, or you had to find it themselves. And a lot of people would just use that as like a way to like try and find out the different areas that they'd like to work in the future. But that wasn't paid. So it's sort of that the initial contact you have with work, you're not paid for. So it sort of sets a precedent for the future, where you're like, okay, yeah, like what Nkechi was saying, you basically like have to do it just to get the experience. And like my parents have always told me, like, yeah, you have to do it just so that you sort of get the experience in it, and then you can apply those skills elsewhere. And it's just like something good that you can put on your CV, basically. But obviously, that's just not workable, and like with different people's circumstances. So yeah, I think
it's only workable for some people.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely starting off with education and just setting the precedent that you do deserve to be paid for your time, just like everyone else that goes to work. And it's not that because you're young, it's like it's seen that you shouldn't have to be paid, because it's like, what do young people pay for? But so many people have different like backgrounds where they're like either like supporting their families or having to finish school early so that they can go out and find a job, and it just doesn't help that they're not seen as people that should get a full wage, essentially. So yeah.
That's a really interesting point what you made about, you know, the work experience you do it at school. It kind of sets the tone of what your value is. Nothing. Finn, did you have anything you wanted to add about what you think may make the biggest impact? And somebody else has also asked in the chat, which kind of tags onto this question, whether you've got any examples of good practice in employment you've had that could kind of lead the way on fair employment conditions for young people.
Yeah, thanks Priya. I think I can sort of take those two at the same time. But I think a really good best practice would be to take a look at fair, good employment charters, or I think they're called good and fair employment charters. So those are basically a voluntary and accreditation scheme that companies can sign up to that promotes good work and education on it. And there is some work been done on youth employment charters as well. So I think from like a kind of techie policy perspective, I think proper mechanisms of enforcement to kind of push companies to sign up to these good employment charters would really benefit young people, specifically from a legislative angle. And I think that, yeah, I think as kind of Olivia was saying, like, I think matching young people's ambition with funding and paying us for our time. You know, a lot of my experience of being in school was someone would come in with, you know, would look over your CV and then tell you to apply for a local shop or whatever, and that's absolutely fine. But for that doesn't really work for everyone. It's not a catch-all situation. So I think you know, putting resource where ambition is, and you know, in working class communities we have a lot of ambition but not a lot of resource. So I think leveling the playing field in that respect would be really helpful, and kind of encourage best practice as well. Yeah,
thank you. So I've got another question here from Martha in the chat. So it's an open question to everybody. Why do you think this issue has not been at the forefront of political debate so far? That might be one for you, Patrick. Yes.
Thanks. Thanks. It's a really good question. Thank you, Martha. And I hate to say it, but I think the perception is, and I disagree strongly with it, but the perception is that young people aren't interested in politics. And you know, young people don't vote at the same rate that sort of older generations do, and that's a continuing thing. And I personally feel very passionate that young people do matter in politics, and we do need to make sure we have our voices heard. I mean, things we can, and you know, the average age of a local councillor I think is like 59. Average age of an MP is well over 50, I believe. We are not in the room when political decisions over employment rights are made. And that means that our rights and our needs get ignored in favour of the people who do vote and who are represented in those rooms. So what we need to make sure that we do as young people fighting for our rights is that we are there in the room. Write to your local MP, write to your councillors, turn up to debates on things like this. Do what I do and stand for election yourself. I think the opportunities are there, but we're not going to be given representation. We do need to make sure we acquire it for ourselves and make sure that we can represent our own beliefs and our own perspectives and our own needs in those meetings where those decisions get made.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Has anyone got anything they wanted to add? I have another question I've written down here, but don't forget, please do put more questions in while we've got our speakers here. So the question that I've got, which I can pose to everybody, is: do you feel that the issues raised by this report, and some of the discrimination that we've seen about unpaid overtime, unpaid trial shifts, do you think they're kind of universal, or do you think they are more keenly felt by young people, or specific to young people in the workforce? I don't know who. Someone's got an opinion.
Sorry, could you repeat the examples you gave?
So just whether we feel the issues raised, such as unpaid trial shifts, unpaid overtime, not being paid for work that you've done, being asked to kind of work unpaid shifts to compete for jobs that there's only 2 jobs but 50 people are doing shifts to try and get them. Do you think those issues are universal, or do you think they're more keenly felt by young people in the workforce, or do you think people of all ages are kind of experiencing something similar?
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's definitely, from young people I speak to, an experience that is shared, and I think some perhaps older people look back and, like we said, some of us hear from our parents, we had to do it, your generation will have to do it. But I think also turning to older people I work with and older people whose opinions I really value, I think it's sometimes a shift in the exploitation, and based off other factors, like not always age. So I think one thing from involvement with employee groups in some of my past work is kind of the exploitation and the unsaid issues around like race or migration status and the pressure people face to be in the office because of needing the security of a job more than people who are perhaps secure in other ways. So I think it's a shifting of pressures. I think if you knew your visa is tied to a job, and even though no one's asking you to stay in the office longer and you have that subconscious pressure, it's kind of it's a different thing. It's not the age and not knowing your rights. And I don't even think it's always not knowing your rights. I think if you've got to do the trial shift, because if you challenge it at that, you're not going to get the job, evidently. Or if you need more shifts and you have to stay late, or you feel some sort of sanction or less shifts in the future. I think sometimes it's not just not knowing, but also knowing the position you're in and the insecurity you're in, and how that kind of leads to us doing or having to comply to these unfair practices. I can also imagine across a gendered dimension where people from other minoritized groups and underrepresented groups, it's a lot harder to speak up for your employment rights, even when you know them, if your identity also influences your position within the workforce.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nkechi. I think that's absolutely right. That a power imbalance, and where we're talking about people with reduced levels of power, I think the likelihood and the potential for exploitation, I think you're right, is kind of elevated, isn't it? It felt that's what you were kind of working towards. That's what you were saying there. Does anybody else have any thoughts about whether these issues are kind of more keenly felt with young people? Or wanting to add anything to that? No? Okay, I'll move on to another question. So we talked, I think you raised it in your conversation and presentation, Finn, is where you were talking about empowering the next generation and ensuring that, they can, know what their rights are and fight for their rights. So, other than education, what kind of things do you think we could do as organisations or as people that aren't young people? How can we support young people to be more empowered in their employment rights?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think fundamentally for me, it's about reframing the employment conversation around cooperation and not competition. So there was a lot of stuff that I was touching on in my kind of speech, as it were. about how we're kind of pitted against each other. So, for example, in these unpaid trial shifts, the one that I referenced, there was 30 people for 2 jobs, and it's a kind of laissez-faire approach to kind of early employment that pits you against other people. So I think when we talk about recruitment and hiring for jobs and things like that, I think it's really important to have youth voice at the center of it. So potentially going forward, other companies could have young people involved in that recruitment process. So when they come to see jobs that they want to apply for, they've already kind of been on the other end of things. So I think it's often about reframing the conversation and flipping the script and making sure that young people don't find out things when it's too late, or when they've already kind of felt the economic precarity and insecurity. Setting people up for a good life is so important, and that does obviously start with education. So I think, being in those schools and encouraging people to cooperate and not compete.
Thank you. Oh, one small thing I always do when I see an internship opportunity posted on LinkedIn, I comment back and ask if it's paid, and if not, why not? That's a good suggestion, Danae. So I think, do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Danae. I see, like, I'm a business owner, and I see a lot of other business owners who, get this idea of cheap labor and, free labor and things like that. And so one thing that I like to do is just publicly and vocally call it out anytime I see it. And also, and it's just little stuff, because, I can get away with it. I can just say, hey, is that one paid? It's not cool if it's not. And, you see these kinds of things posting all the time on LinkedIn and other places like that. So it's so small, but I think a lot of this is just, as Nkechi was saying, this is about, like, well, it's inevitable. That's the idea, that this is inevitable. And every little pick at that inevitability of it, pointing out how glaringly unfair it is, I think just helps in a tiny little way. And so at minimum, I think just picking at it can help.
Yeah. Yeah, the inevitability is a kind of like a put up and shut up kind of thing, isn't it? And it's not just the person that you're responding to that sees it and feels challenged. It's other people that see it and think, oh, actually, I can challenge, or I don't have to put up with it. Oh, Rosalind has a comment on this inevitability thing. Would you like to come and comment for us, Rosalind?
Yeah. Hi, it's Rosalind.
Hi, sorry, my mistake.
I didn't realise I had a theatre in the background. Never mind.
I like it.
What was just said by Danae, was interesting to me, because I worked in the theatre for many years, and of course we all do lots and lots of unpaid work in the theatre, in Fringe and things like that. You're trying to break through, and in a way that's a very atypical industry, so it's kind of you don't expect to. I mean, it's not great to work for free, but it's a different culture. But one of the things I think is interesting about this idea of it being inevitable, that people will expect you to work for free, is partly that and that you were calling people out, Danae, and making it clear. And I think that's really important. And I'm retired now, unfortunately. But I'm nearly 60, and I mix with quite a lot of people who are fairly well off in the charity world and also locally. And what really horrifies me is how little people understand about the conditions in which their incredibly convenient lives are enabled. And I was with a group of friends the other day, some of whom I like more than others, and one of the ones I like less. She was talking about Amazon Prime and how brilliant it is, and I said, well, yeah, no, I don't use Amazon at all, because it's exploitative and horrible, and they need to treat their people better. And she said, oh, I didn't know. And I explained what it was like working for Amazon, because I'd read about it and I'm aware of it. And talking about how people couldn't go for loo breaks and they had to keep working or they wouldn't make enough money, and that they, the reason things are sometimes come in big boxes when they're only small is because they can't leave their workstation to go and get a more suitable box and things like that. It's just this awful treadmill that these people are on. And this particular person who's a very, upstanding member of the community, and religious as well, said, "Oh yes, but it's just so convenient, isn't it, when you've got Amazon Prime?" And I was really shocked that I hadn't made a dent in her perception of whether it was a good idea to use that service, to treat people like that.
Yeah.
If you'd said, "Oh, you shouldn't buy things that are from child labour in a far country, across the sea with people who are not like us at all," sort of thing. You can kind of understand that people have that kind of antediluvian attitude. But the fact that she couldn't even see it, that something that she was literally buying herself directly from that company was actually something that was part of a terrible exploitation of people. And I know they're not all young people working at Amazon. I know there's all different ages, but I think people have this idea about young people, and it's a pervasive attitude. It's like your enemy is both incredibly strong and incredibly weak. And it happens like the group that I'm choosing not to honour are both, oh, they're young, they're strong, they can live on no money, they can,
Sorry, Rosalind, can I just interject with a question while we've got our panel here? Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So,
yes, I'm going
sorry.
on.
Yes.
I'll shut up now. But yeah, I think it's something about raising awareness among consumers as well.
Yes, that's actually a very good point. Thank you. So we talked about one of the important things for young people could be kind of increasing their knowledge about their employment rights, and so I just wondered if any of the young people around the panel today might be able to share with us what they think an ideal employment rights education resource might look like. What kind of age do you think we might want to start talking to young people about their employment rights? And what would we say?
I can come in on this if you'd like. I would say like the best age would be to start maybe like just before 16, like 40, like in the years leading up, because it is a lot of information to take in. It's easy to give that education, say when you're like 13, 14, and then like I would have forgotten it when I was younger, and then just forget like what kind of rights you have, and they're obviously always changing, so you don't want to give it too soon and then suddenly it's just unapplicable. But I didn't, and like how I would have wanted that to be given, I'm not sure. I think maybe having actual classes that were dedicated to like employment rights and how you should be treated at work would have been the best thing for it. Like hearing it from your teachers, hearing about other people's experiences, because I think I found in the past the way that I've learned the most is from like my other managers or people I've been working with, and how they've had experiences in the past, and finding out basically what their working rights are. So I think something like that where people can just share experiences, and then maybe this can be applied like across the country, people going to different classrooms basically and telling people what they should expect in the workplace would be the best.
So a bit of a combination between facts and figures and actual legislation policies, and hearing people's kind of stories. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add on to that about ideal way of communicating employment rights to young people? Nkechi, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I can try and add. I thought that what Olivia showed was really interesting, but also kind of borrowing from some of my other work elsewhere. So I spoke about working with young people, and that tends to be around misogyny and that sort of things. But I think one thing I've learned from that, and I'd apply here, is making education appropriate at every age level. And I think there's a lot to be said about like the conversations and education you need that's more practical. But I also think some of the themes that came up in the research was what employment rights and exploitation in the working world is about, and some of the things we've discussed today. And I think sometimes it can be like just things about respect, bringing it into the curriculum, valuing people's work, your own work, empowering young people to be able to take ownership of what they contribute to society or what they work on. And because I think it's quite an interesting conversation, and it's an interesting conversation alongside someone who also enjoys like volunteering with different organizations. But I think the themes of like empowerment, respect, understanding your value, also understanding that as a young person you're not powerless is something that could be included more throughout the curriculum, even if it's not explicitly about employment rights. And then I think, like, alongside what others have said, like when young people do actually start working, if they've got this base level around not feeling disempowered, and I think as someone who's really passionate about young people and accessibility in education and equality in education, is how sometimes we can really disempower young people, and it doesn't just start when we're in the job market. So I think, yeah, more empowerment young people and recognition of that.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat now, so thank you for those. We've got Ruth here saying that the acceptance of unpaid internships adversely impact people on lower income, but they also impact others, including disabled young people who may need reasonable adjustments to be made. So what would the group's advice be on trying to include disabled young people? Has anyone in the group got any experience or any? Ruth, I think we might have to find, it might not be within the area of expertise of the people on this panel, but I mean, I'm happy to reach out to you later and see if we can get some advice on how we can address this, because obviously you're right, there's lots of intersectionality between different people with power imbalances and discriminations that we can look at, and I'm sure there must be stuff we've got in the Equality Trust, so we can try and find you an answer there outside of this space. I know we're really running out of time. I've just got one final question, which is on unions. I'd be interested in if the panel could expand on unions. So we had some recommendations in the report, so they're quite strong, but we'd be good to hear from the young people more about perhaps some of the barriers and difficulties experienced by younger workers. Has anybody got?
I can just touch on that briefly. I know we're running out of time now, but I think, I've had an experience in the past where an employer has discouraged me from joining a union, and I believe that's technically illegal. So I think we need to kind of flip the script and encourage employers to realize the incentives of having a strong unionized youth workforce and how that reflects better on them, because obviously, as we were saying before, equality is better for everyone in the long run. Yeah, but I just wanted to say that quickly.
Thank you very much. And sorry, we're just coming up to our 7 o'clock close off time. So I want to say a very huge thank you to all of our speakers for joining us this evening and sharing their experiences of working on the report, their experiences of employment, and all their insights and understanding of what's happening in the employment world for them right at the moment. Our report can be downloaded. We've got a Your Time, Your Pay hub on our website, equalitytrust.org.uk. If you go to the homepage there, you can find the link straight to the report hub, and you can download the report, find more information about our schools resources, and get all the polling information there. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us this evening. I'm sorry we've just about run over time. Thank you so much to all of our speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Bye.